Welcome to Free Media. I'm Amber Duke.
And I'm Robby Soave. Well, the Trump administration says that it mistakenly deported a Salvadorian man with protected status to a prison in El Salvador, where they now say they can't secure his release. The admission of error came after his wife identified him in footage of deported migrants. Let's watch.
We have been reporting on multiple families and attorneys who say that people were sent to this El Salvadoran prison who shouldn't have been there to begin with. And in this case, Immigration and Customs Enforcement is saying very bluntly that this was due to an administrative error with this Salvadoran national in particular. Now, a little bit of background as to who this is. His name is Gilmar Abrego Garcia. He's a Salvadoran national. He crossed into the U.S. around 2011. His first brush with law enforcement appears to be in 2019 when he was detained along with a group of men who were loitering around a Maryland Home Depot. And the local police department deemed that he was a member of MS-13, saying or arguing that it was due to his attire and a confidential informant. Now, efforts to get more information from the police department about these alleged ties were not fruitful, according to his attorney, when he was going through his immigration court proceedings again back in 2019. Ultimately that year, an immigration judge granted him a protected status known as withholding from removal.
But some argue it's a bit more complicated than that. While the news sparked outrage with former Obama bro Jon Favreau calling out Vice President J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio and others on X, Vance responded like this. He said that the man was a convicted MS-13 gang member.
What's more, as X-user A.G. Hamilton points out, the court filings reveal that the man essentially, quote, argued that despite his being here illegally and likely being a gang member based on the previous finding, he could be tortured if sent back to El Salvador. Such an order could still allow the government to deport him, but not to his home country, at least not without first contesting the order. He has been using that order since 2019 to avoid deportation.
But that point is also being disputed, as one immigration policy analyst said on X, quote, in 2019, a police informant alleged the guy was in MS-13. He then spent a year in ICE detention as a result and won his case. He's been out for the last 5 years, married to a U.S. citizen, has 2 kids, still has no criminal record at all. No doubt this is a complicated matter, with more individuals sent to the El Salvadorian prison claiming to be innocent. Even Joe Rogan is having doubts about the Trump administration's approach on this issue. Let's watch.
And I think a human being being plucked out of nowhere and ending up in a country he's never been in a maximum security prison with gang members, seems like a bad thing to happen to me.
It's horrific. It's horrific.
I don't think that should be controversial.
No, that's not controversial at all. And this is the thing, you know, measured twice, cut once.
Yeah.
This is kind of crazy that could be possible. That's horrific. And that's bad for the cause. Like, the cause is, let's get the gang members out. Everybody agrees. But let's not innocent gay hairdressers get lumped up with the gangs. And then, like, how long before that guy can get out? Can we figure out how to get him out? Is there any plan in place to alert the authorities that they've made a horrible mistake and correct it?
Well, if you think about it from a government perspective, and this is where I think it gets quite sinister, is once you've done that, the incentive structure is never going to be to admit that and deal with it. The incentive structure is to say nothing, to cover it up, to pretend it didn't happen.
But
right?
That is horrible.
So this was them not talking about this specific case. Actually, the case they referenced there was this other individual, a hairdresser who is not part of a gang, or it's been claimed is not actually part of a gang, who was deported on this basis as well. And yeah, like Joe Rogan, I think this is very, concerning for the government to make these kinds of mistakes. They admit this was a mistake. And I understand that this situation is a little bit complicated with respect to this individual. I don't, automatically believe his attorney's insistence that he's not part of MS-13, but I automatically don't believe the media claiming that. I also don't just believe the government or the judge, whoever was making that determination based on what sounded like an informant saying that. So I don't really quite know what the situation is, but it seems like he was not alleged to have done something violent or gang-related and has been married to a U.S. citizen for several years and was specifically not supposed to be deported to El Salvador, where he could face violence. So it seems like a bad thing to happen.
I'll fill in some of the gaps here. I spent a few hours this morning reading literally all of the court documents to make sure I was prepared. But so he first came illegally to the U.S. in 2011, and it was in 2019 that he was first picked up by immigration authorities in this Home Depot case that they're referencing. And in addition to the confidential informant, and then they said he was wearing Chicago Bulls attire, which is sometimes means you're a member of MS-13, but obviously not always. But I think
Not everyone who wears Chicago Bulls attire is part of a gang.
There also are not a lot of Chicago Bulls fans in Maryland. But the interesting piece of this that hasn't been floated around on Twitter or in a lot of these media reports that I found particularly compelling is that the other individuals he was with at the Home Depot that he was arrested with were not just MS-13 gang members, but actually ranking members of the gang. So I find that to be a more credible piece of evidence. You know, he's hanging around with MS-13 ranking members in attire that is typically associated with the gang, and a confidential informant confirmed not only his gang nickname, but also his rank in the gang. He did not dispute, or at least effectively dispute, any of those facts in his first two immigration court hearings. There was the initial hearing where the judge said that they found the evidence credible and he was ordered to be removed. Then he appealed the process, and the Board of Appeals, which is obviously made up of a separate group of judges, confirmed that they believed the evidence was credible and that he had not sufficiently rebutted any of the evidence from the authorities. Then, instead of taking it further, he could have appealed again. Instead, what he did is he filed a separate claim in immigration court that he cannot an asylum claim. After 8 years of being in the U.S. illegally, coming up with this fantastical story about how his family's pupuseria back in El Salvador was being targeted by Barrio 18, which is a rival gang to MS-13, which I think is relevant considering he's accused of being an MS-13 member. But apparently they were trying to extort the pupuseria business, and so his family sent him to the United States to save him from this aggression from Barrio 18, even though he had siblings and none of those apparently needed to come to the U.S. He was a specific target of the gang for some reason.
Maybe he was in the rival gang and those siblings weren't.
That's what I think is likely to have happened. But just to go further on that, none of the supporting evidence actually came from his family back in El Salvador. It only came from the two members of his family that were living in the United States, one of them legally. So they didn't actually provide any real evidence for those claims about them being targeted by Barrio 18. And I'm not sure why the immigration judge in this case granted the withdrawal of removal. But needless to say, he could have been removed to literally any other country at any time. Now you fast forward to 2025, and I'm sure we'll get into the details about how he ended up on that flight and how the government did make the administrative error in this case. But I think it's important to point out that with the recent deportation, he is now not claiming that he is going to face retribution from Barrio 18. He has now substantially changed the fundamentals of his claim. He now says that the problem is that he is going to face torture and potential death from the government and the prison conditions, which is not the substance of his original claim for asylum.
Sure. I have no idea whether he is actually a member of MS-13 based on the sequence of events. There's some evidence, that you've spelled out there. I still just don't want someone to be in this really awful prison our government is now saying we should not have sent him there, but we can't do anything about it now that he's there. Right, well, that's the position of the government.
Right, because what happened was he was an alternate on the deportation flight, and the person in front of him, for whatever reason, couldn't go, and they were supposed to not have anyone on the manifest that had some kind of block to proceedings, which would include the withdrawal of removal. So I think what probably happened is the government probably intended to dispute that in court, and then the process moved so quickly that for some reason the documents did not move from the alternate list to the manifest, which was a huge mistake and shouldn't have happened. But that being said, this guy's a Salvadorian national. Once he is deported to El Salvador, it's up to Bukele whether or not he goes to this prison, not the U.S. government.
Yeah. I think, it starts to get into philosophical territory, right? How much you're willing to let a innocent person suffer some consequence if you're going to have a rush process or a process that doesn't have all of the due process protections that those of us who are concerned about this want in place, so we make sure that we don't make any mistakes of this variety, or like the hairdresser case, or a handful of other cases where there were a couple of cases now where a person was not actually deported, but they had them in detention for a certain amount of time. Thank goodness they didn't deport them, because it turned out they were American citizens or they were not subject to deportation. Look, I get that these are illegal immigrants at the end of the day, and so some amount of action can be taken against them, but I think it's going to start spooking people. Stories about, even though we can't trust the media on everything and there's a lot of spin, stories of people also married to an American citizen, right? You can get
got
a green
married while
card
he was
on
in
those
detention.
circumstances. But it's like, I don't know. I think a lot of people are worried about the people being disappeared around them without having it argued properly in court, and the government admits they screwed up and says, oh well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case it's a little bit different because he did have due process on the MS-13 claims. He did have due process as to whether or not he was actually an illegal alien. Like, that fact, at least, is not disputed by any of the parties involved, except for the Atlantic article, which listed him as a Maryland father, which is an interesting spin.
I mean, everybody's a father, yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's somebody's child, everybody's somebody. That doesn't matter. Although, again, there's no... The underlying accusation is that he was hanging out in a parking lot with some really sketchy dudes, right? Where's the
and there's
where's the
CI
criminal
as well.
actual behavior? There's no, he didn't help them break into somebody's home.
Being a
being
member of a gang is not in itself a crime, but I
Right.
think we would agree that we don't want people who are in transnational gangs to be in the U.S. illegally.
Right. Yeah, but that's why. But yes, but there's no. That is the dispute, right? Is he a part of this gang? I would want that absolutely proven. And then I would be okay sending
Yeah,
them
I guess
out,
my
but-
point is that it was proven as much as it can be in an immigration court, including on an appeal. That's the same due process that any illegal alien gets. So this is not even talking about the normal process that's followed under the Alien Enemies Act, because he probably had the most due process out of any of the people sitting in that prison right now.
Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think about this. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more free media.